key points and detailed crux. Initial experience at Khidmat Center. The writer needed a police certificate for a visa application and visited a Khidmat Center in Lahore. There was a long queue of approximately 45 men waiting under the hot sun, with no shade or water available. Despite standing for hours, only a few people's documents were processed, indicating an extremely slow system. On a second visit, arriving 30 minutes before the center opened, the writer found about 30 people already in line. After waiting for 3 hours, only 7 or 8 men were processed, forcing the author to leave due to teaching commitments. Lack of basic amenities. Citizens were queuing outside in the summer heat without proper facilities, such as shade or drinking water. The author criticizes the lack of effort in making services easier to access for the public, questioning why a Khidmat center, intended to help, is so difficult to navigate. Positive outcome. Due to complaints, the author reached out to a police officer who responded positively by installing a shade and a water cooler at the center. Moreover, the number of desks handling applications was doubled, speeding up the process. This shows that improvements are possible, but they are often driven by individual complaints rather than systematic reforms. Issues with document attestation processes. The author's friend faced difficulties in attesting documents for a Gulf country, where they needed verification from multiple offices, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and embassies. This required significant time and effort, further reflecting the inefficiency of government services. The broader point is that citizens regularly encounter similar struggles in a range of public services, from police certificates to document attestations. Degree verification problem in Pakistan. Universities award degrees after years of study, but students must still get them verified by the Higher Education Commission, HEC, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for job applications, especially for overseas employment. The author questions why degree verification is needed in the digital age when universities have records of their graduates. They propose a solution. Universities should directly submit student records to HEC, which could automatically verify degrees upon graduation, eliminating the need for students to go through the verification process themselves. Lack of trust in Pakistani documents. The need for multiple layers of verification stems from a lack of trust in Pakistani documents, both domestically and internationally. This mistrust has developed over time due to corruption, fraud, and incompetence in various sectors. As a result, multiple institutions require redundant checks, adding more burden to citizens. Efficient system proposal. The author suggests that universities submit lists of their graduates to HEC, which can pre-verify degrees and issue attested documents to students directly. This would save time and reduce the burden on HEC offices. They also mention that older graduates, whose records are not digitized, may still need to follow the traditional verification process, but the majority of degree holders could benefit from this streamlined system. Checks and balances. The writer acknowledges the need for checks in a society with high levels of corruption and fraud. However, they argue that these checks can be made more efficient. An analogy is used. Just as toll booths are needed on certain roads, the number of booths and their operation during peak hours can significantly affect the flow of traffic. Similarly, the number and efficiency of verification processes matter. Incentives for government reform. Private firms are under pressure to improve processes to stay competitive, whereas governments lack similar incentives. The absence of such pressure, along with weak citizen demands for better services, allows inefficiency to persist. The writer emphasizes that improving these systems is essential not only to ease the burden on citizens, but also to change the public's perception that the government does not care. Crux. The article sheds light on the inefficient and cumbersome bureaucratic processes in Pakistan, which create unnecessary hurdles for citizens seeking services like police certificates, document attestation, and degree verification. The writer shares personal experiences of long queues, lack of basic facilities, and delayed processing times at public service centers. While individual complaints can sometimes lead to improvements, the core problem is the systemic inefficiency caused by mistrust in public documents, corruption, and outdated processes. The writer advocates for a more efficient system, particularly regarding degree verification, suggesting that universities and the HEC collaborate to digitize and automate verification processes. The article also highlights the broader issue of poor governance and the lack of institutional pressure to improve public services. Ultimately, the writer calls for reforms that make bureaucratic processes more citizen-friendly, reduce inefficiencies, and restore trust in Pakistan's institutions. Key points and detailed crux. Inefficient government structure. Pakistan's government operates outdated systems, continuing to perform redundant tasks despite changing global and technological environments. The public sector has expanded unnecessarily, despite the private sector being more efficient in handling many roles. Large federal and provincial bureaucracies. Despite the 18th Amendment, which transferred many functions to the provinces, the federal government remains large with 43 divisions and 400 attached departments employing 650,000 people. There are also 520,000 employees in autonomous organizations, many occupying prime commercial spaces. These functions cost the government over $750 billion annually, even though they should be the responsibility of the provinces. Provincial governments are also bloated, with departments expanding, e.g., Punjab now has 48 departments compared to 22 in 2000, and excessive hiring of unskilled staff, leading to significant pension liabilities, currently exceeding $30 trillion. States' heavy footprint on the economy. A Pakistan Institute of Development Economics (PIDE) study estimates that the government accounts for 67% of the economy. The state maintains 122 regulatory agencies which constrain economic activity and increase the cost of doing business. Many operate under outdated frameworks without clear reasons for their continued existence. Need for government restructuring. The government should focus on strategic functions like defense, foreign policy, taxation, and infrastructure that the private sector cannot provide. Social and economic services could be outsourced, while non-essential functions like running banks, airlines, and utility stores should be eliminated or privatized. Government structures and skill sets should be aligned with this new role, requiring decentralization, delegation of powers, simplification, and automation of processes. Proposal for downsizing the federal government. The writer suggests reducing the federal government by 2/3, mainly by cutting lower-grade 116 positions, which constitute a large portion of salary outlays. Vacant positions should be eliminated, and redundant departments and autonomous organizations should be wound up. Politically difficult decisions, like retiring employees with 25 years of service or placing them in a surplus pool, could save costs on rent, utilities, and car maintenance. Similar restructuring is needed at the provincial level. Defense sector reforms. The defense sector needs to shed non-core commercial activities like those of the NLC, FWO, and Fauji Foundation. The size of conventional forces should be reduced, and non-combat expenditures, such as the continuous upgrading of officer posts, should be reviewed. Military pensions are a significant burden, with 1.4 million pensioners absorbing 3/4 of the annual pension budget. The service age of soldiers could be extended by 4 to 5 years, and non-combat roles even longer, under a contributory pension scheme. Digitalization and efficiency. Reducing the number of agencies and personnel, along with modernizing governance systems, would streamline approvals and transactions. This would lead to better resource allocation, lower management costs, and improved administrative efficiency. Crux. The article argues for a comprehensive restructuring of Pakistan's government to improve service delivery and reduce inefficiency. Despite advancements in the private sector and the 18th Amendment's devolution of powers, both federal and provincial governments remain bloated, performing outdated and redundant tasks. The writer calls for a leaner government structure, focusing on core functions like defense and policymaking, while outsourcing or privatizing non-essential services. The defense establishment also requires downsizing and pension reform to reduce its financial burden. Digitalization and modernization of processes are necessary to increase efficiency, cut costs, and improve governance in Pakistan. Key points and detailed crux. Importance of promises in Islam. Promises, whether verbal or written, represent a firm commitment distinct from intentions. In Islam, promises hold deep significance, mentioned 151 times in the Quran, urging Muslims to fulfill their word. The Quran, 1734, emphasizes that all promises and engagements will be questioned on the Day of Judgment, making them sacred and binding. Types of promises in Islam: promises from God to humans, concerning this life and the Day of Judgment. Human souls promise to God, before coming to this world, acknowledging Him as the Creator and only Lord. Promises between humans, which define social relationships and hold moral and ethical weight. Breaking promises and hypocrisy. The Prophet Muhammad, PBUH, highlighted 3 signs of a hypocrite, one of which is breaking promises, Sahih Bukhari. Despite this, people often break promises casually, both to each other and to God, turning commitments into meaningless rituals. Hypocrisy in this context refers to saying one thing but meaning another, which has become widespread in personal, political, and social interactions. Ethics and promises in a Muslim's life. Keeping promises is not only ethical, but also deeply tied to Islamic teachings. Muslims are accountable to God for every promise made in this life. Breaking promises, whether small or large, will lead to divine accountability in the afterlife. Social habit of breaking promises. In daily life, people make and break promises with ease, such as arriving late for events despite prior commitments. This habit reflects a broader issue of taking promises lightly and not respecting commitments. Sycophancy as a form of hypocrisy. Sycophants exaggerate and create false images of people or policies, defending even harmful actions as beneficial. 2 examples are the extravagant spending of government officials amid Pakistan's economic crisis and the repression of human rights despite promises to uphold democracy and dignity. Religious hypocrisy in modern times. The growing religiosity in Pakistan is coupled with the breaking of both types of promises, to God and fellow humans. Hypocrisy and sycophancy are prevalent, and promises are seldom fulfilled. Crux. The article explores the concept of promises in Islam and their moral and spiritual significance. In Islam, promises are not just words but commitments that must be fulfilled, and breaking them is seen as a sign of hypocrisy. The author laments the casual attitude towards promises in both personal and public life, where promises to God, to each other, and in governance are frequently broken. The piece calls for a deeper understanding of the seriousness of promises and urges society to honor commitments to restore trust, dignity, and moral integrity. Key points. Punjab's central role in Pakistan. Punjab is the heartland of Pakistan, both in terms of its population and its political and economic influence. Even without the Saraiki Belt, Punjabis are the country's largest ethnic linguistic group, holding the largest share of economic resources and wielding substantial political power. The military's dominance in Pakistan has historically been sustained by Punjab, with much of its rank-and-file and leadership coming from the province. There has been popular support for the national security state from within Punjabi society. Fracturing consensus with the establishment. Recent political conflict between the establishment and the PTI, Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, has sparked a more vocal critique of military dominance, especially among younger generations in Punjab. The fragmentation of Punjab's political elite, with some powerful families opposing the current military brass, has complicated the relationship between the people and the military. Working-class youth and PTI support. The support for PTI, especially among young working-class Punjabis, highlights a rising anti-establishment sentiment. These youths admire Imran Khan and are vocal critics of the military's interference in politics, but this raises the question of whether this sentiment will persist if ruling-class elites re-enter the political mainstream. Economic grievances and anti-establishment sentiment. The PTI gained support by emphasizing economic issues, blaming inflation, unemployment, and economic hardship on the military's ousting of Imran Khan's government. However, a deeper critique of the establishment's economic order, which includes military-controlled businesses and defense budget allocations, is necessary to bring about real change. A welfare-oriented political economy that redistributes wealth away from the military is essential for sustaining anti-establishment politics. Punjab's relationship with other ethnic groups. The establishment's power relies on privileging Islam and Urdu, while suppressing ethnic identity and autonomy, particularly among groups like the Balok, Pashtun, and Sindhi. There is a question of whether Punjab's working-class youth will extend their anti-establishment sentiment to support movements like the PTM, Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, and BYC, Baloch Youth Council, which are often repressed by the state. The core periphery divide. Addressing the deep-rooted economic and political disparities between Punjab and Pakistan's peripheral regions is crucial to building a collective future. Ecological crises that affect all regions further emphasize the need for solidarity across geographic and ethnic divides. Crux, Punjab, historically central to Pakistan's political and military dominance, is experiencing a shift as younger generations, particularly working-class youth, express anti-establishment sentiment. This newfound dissent is partly driven by economic frustrations and the perceived unfairness of military hegemony. However, for meaningful change to occur, this movement must challenge the broader economic order and extend solidarity to marginalized ethnic groups. Addressing the core periphery divide is essential for a future that moves beyond elite power struggles and military control. Key points: PTM ban and conflict with the state. A standoff is emerging between the Pakistani state and the recently banned Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, PTM, over a tribal jirga assembly planned by the PTM in KP, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Both the central government and the KP authorities have warned that the gathering cannot take place, leading to clashes between PTM supporters and law enforcement, with claims that 3 activists were killed. Government's response: Interior Minister Mohsin Naqvi has offered to hold talks, but has warned that incitement against state institutions will not be tolerated. While the state expresses interest in dialogue, it is applying pressure, limiting the PTM's activities through the use of force. Historical and regional context. The PTM draws its support largely from KP and the former FATA regions, which have endured decades of violence, displacement, and militancy, particularly since the War on Terror began. Other factors fueling the PTM's rise include underdevelopment and allegations of state excesses. These issues have created long-standing discontent in these regions. Parallel movements in other regions. Similar movements like the Baloch Yakjedi Committee (BYC) in Balochistan share grievances with the PTM, especially regarding enforced disappearances and lack of constitutional rights. Such movements highlight the disconnect between peripheral regions and the state as they demand recognition and redress of their grievances. Mainstream discontent. It is not just the peripheries that are in conflict with the state. The PTI, Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, has mounted a protest campaign, resonating mostly in Punjab and urban KP, in response to efforts by the state to weaken its leadership. Call for democratic engagement. The state needs to consider these voices of dissent as opportunities for dialogue rather than threats. Listening to disaffected populations can help prevent the situation from escalating further. All movements and political parties must remain peaceful and respect the law, while the state must engage with their concerns without suppressing them, as silencing dissent can lead to radicalization and separatism. Crux. The growing tensions between the Pakistani state and movements like the PTM highlight the deeper, unresolved issues faced by peripheral regions like KP and Balochistan, which have long suffered from violence, displacement, and underdevelopment. Instead of forcibly suppressing these movements, the state should view them as opportunities for democratic engagement. Open dialogue and addressing legitimate grievances are essential to fostering national harmony and preventing further radicalization, militancy, or separatist sentiments. Key points: climate change and the need for cooperation. Climate change is a global issue that transcends borders, requiring both multilateral and bilateral cooperation. In this context, Punjab Chief Minister Maryam Nawaz has called for climate diplomacy with India to tackle air pollution and smog, particularly between Indian and Pakistani Punjab, given the shared environmental challenges. Challenges in bilateral collaboration. Given the current strained political relations between Pakistan and India, initiating a climate alliance may seem difficult, but it is essential due to the severe pollution affecting both countries. The air quality in major cities like Amritsar, New Delhi, and Lahore is critically poor, with Delhi and Lahore often competing for the undesirable position of having the worst air quality in the world. Joint action for common environmental issues. Collaboration between the two countries would enable them to create a unified strategy to address climate change and advocate for the region's shared environmental concerns on global platforms. This joint action could help tackle the common enemy of climate change more effectively, as both countries face similar issues related to air quality. Domestic responsibility and polluters. While it is easy to blame stubble burning in Indian Punjab for the smog in Lahore, local factors are equally significant. Key contributors to Lahore's poor air quality include increasing vehicular emissions and toxic fuels used by undocumented industries, such as steel factories around the city. Without addressing these domestic issues, any bilateral or multilateral measures will have limited impact on improving air quality. Crux: the call for climate diplomacy between India and Pakistan to tackle the shared challenge of smog and pollution is timely and necessary. However, while diplomatic efforts and regional cooperation are important, addressing domestic contributors to pollution, such as vehicular emissions and unregulated industrial activity, remains crucial. Both countries must take responsibility for their environmental issues and collaborate on a common strategy to effectively combat the climate crisis and improve air quality. Key points and detailed crux: delay in agricultural tax reforms, the implementation of a new tax regime for agricultural income, agreed upon under the National Fiscal Pact and part of the IMF's conditions, has been postponed to July 1, 2025. Legislation for this reform is expected by January 2025. The IMF had recommended aligning taxes on agricultural income with the tax structure for non-salaried individuals, but this critical reform is now delayed by 6 months. Resistance from key figures. Political leaders, such as President Asif Zardari, have expressed reservations about the proposal, framing it as an external condition imposed by the IMF rather than recognizing it as necessary for Pakistan's financial stability. This reflects a broader reluctance among powerful groups who benefit from the current agricultural tax system, including politicians, bureaucrats, military officials, and judges. Challenges in taxing the agricultural sector. The agricultural sector in Pakistan is geographically dispersed and largely undocumented, making it difficult to impose a fair and effective tax regime. This lack of documentation has allowed agricultural tax reforms to be deferred for decades, despite the sector's significance to the economy. Burden on tax-compliant sectors. The tax burden continues to fall on tax-compliant sectors and the salaried class, who have been pushed to their limits, while the agricultural sector enjoys tax privileges for yet another year. The delay further exacerbates the inequality in the tax structure, despite the country's dire financial condition. Crux: the postponement of agricultural tax reforms is a setback for Pakistan's efforts to address its financial challenges. Despite the IMF's recommendation and the dire need for a fairer tax regime, resistance from influential groups has once again delayed critical changes. As the salaried and tax-compliant sectors continue to bear the burden, the agricultural sector retains its privileges. There is hope that the reforms will not face further delays beyond 2025, but the postponement reflects long-standing structural issues in the country's taxation system.